Hi, I hope everyone is doing well today. We are still going over the three branches of government, and so I'm going to give you a quick overview of the executive branch. Hopefully, everybody knows that the branches basically have shared powers. In other words, one branch is not able to completely do something on its own without oversight from other branches. This creates a system also of checks and balances that are very important in the democratic process. And so if you were to look at Article 2 of the Constitution, you would find the executive branch. And so when Article 2 was drafted, it's kind of important to know that it was drafted with George Washington in the room. I think in a lot of ways, when looking at the different roles that were granted to the president, roles and duties, there's definitely an argument to be made that George Washington was sort of the template from which it was built upon. But before we go over those, I do want to mention to be President of the United States, you have to be at least 35 years of age. You have to be a natural born citizen, which means you have to have been born on U.S. soil, or you have to have been born to parents who were citizens. If you were somebody who has parents who are citizens, but you were born outside of the country, you are considered to be a natural born citizen. This is really important because we have a lot of military families stationed throughout the world, and obviously it would be, really awkward to not allow for children to have citizenship. John McCain is a good example of somebody. I believe his father was in the Navy, and I believe John McCain was born in Panama, actually. But you also have to have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. And so, in other words, even though you may be somebody who traveled abroad, spent some years living elsewhere, the idea is that you should be in the United States at least for 14 years. And that's so that you can really kind of understand our culture, some of our traditions, and things like that. So, let's go down the roles. The chief of state is basically the president is a figurehead for the United States. He's the ceremonial figurehead, he or she, both at home and abroad. So this is an important role. And it kind of, when you see the president, for example, awarding medals, or you see the president sort of going on goodwill tours to different countries, this sort of falls under that role. Next in line is the chief diplomat. A diplomat is somebody who works with foreign countries and people from foreign countries. So if somebody refers to like diplomatic relations, they're referring to relations between the United States and another country. A lot of these also have cabinet positions. Cabinet positions consist of all the different secretaries, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, the Attorney General. And so a lot of these types of roles also have oftentimes a member of the cabinet who complements and helps the president. So for example, the president's role is the chief diplomat. Oftentimes the cabinet member who is taking the lead sometimes on that role is the Secretary of State. So, but as the chief diplomat, the president actually gets to appoint ambassadors, like with all presidential appointments, whether it's cabinet members or federal judges. They are subject to confirmation of the Senate, but it is important to note that the president as the chief diplomat can do a lot when it comes to who we have diplomatic ties with, what kind of relationship we have with countries. And so you might think of an example of when a president got elected, how maybe he or she set out to have a different relationship with a country than maybe a previous administration. So it happens often. Next in line is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. It's very important to have some kind of centralized control over the armed forces. Obviously, if you had a branch of the military under one branch of government and then the other branch, it would be kind of confusing. And so the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the President, can actually use the armed forces to defend the United States. And if there is some kind of a war, this allows for more centralized control, which is a good thing. It's important to note, though, that Congress actually has oversight over this in that only Congress can declare war. In other words, the president can use troops for defense reasons and things, but as far as committing to an all-out war, that requires permission from Congress. I do want to point out that we have not actually had a declaration of war since World War II. A lot of concerns, contemporary concerns, is that we have been involved in areas of the world and in other conflicts without actually having formal declarations of war. If you're familiar with the Vietnam conflict, I'm sure it felt like a war to those men who were over there, but technically it was considered to be a conflict because a war was never declared. The current war against terrorism, which has taken the United States into places like Afghanistan, when the U.S., for example, went and invaded Iraq, Congress passed a resolution to allow President George W. Bush to do that, but there was no actual declaration of war. So, be mindful of those things. Also be mindful when you're reading this week that we do have something called a War Powers Resolution that was basically passed in Congress at the heels of the Vietnam War that was meant to kind of limit the president's ability to send troops somewhere for too long without having some sort of congressional permission for obvious reasons, because the Vietnam conflict went on for a really long time without a declaration of war. So next in line is Chief Administrator. The President is considered to be the Chief Administrator, and of course one of the things that he does is he appoints, or she appoints, the people who are going to be in charge of the Cabinet. So for example, the Department of Labor has a Labor Secretary. We have the Attorney General, who's technically over the Justice Department. And, heads even of like the FBI are appointed by the President. So it's not necessarily that the President's supposed to put people, in these positions who are not qualified, but it's important to find people who are qualified for these positions, because basically this is how government runs. We have a very large government. So we have all these heads of different divisions and departments, but the President does have some say-so in who heads those federal divisions. And so for that reason, the President is considered to be a Chief Administrator. Of course, those appointments are subject to congressional approval. Specifically, the Senate has to be the one to confirm that. The next one in line there kind of falls in with our video from last time, which is the President is the Chief Legislator. Hopefully by now you know that in order for a bill to pass, it has to go through a process of being introduced in a house. It has to pass through a particular house, and then it has to pass through the other house. So if it starts in the Senate or House of Representatives, vice versa. If a bill actually manages to pass both of those, it goes to the President, and the President can sign it into law, and the President can also veto it. The President can lay it on his desk for 10 days and not sign it, but then it'll become a law. The President can also make notes and send it back to Congress with suggestions. In other words, saying, I'll veto it now, but if you were to make these changes, I would probably be okay with that. But because of that power, the President actually influences legislation a great deal even before it gets to his or her desk. Because if you have the ability to try to veto something, and in other words, if Congress is trying to pass something and they know there's no way a president is going to actually sign off on it unless they're doing it to make a point, which does happen, a lot of times what will happen is they will, ask the president for some input, just because they want it to pass. Next in line is the President is considered to be a party leader. The President is a major leader in his party if the party wants him. Obviously, if you have a president who is affiliated with either the Democratic or Republican Party, that person is kind of expected to sometimes show up for fundraising events, to kind of push a party's agenda. I do want to mention that there are sometimes exceptions to this. There have been cases before where there have been people who, for example, are running for office who don't really want a president around. One good example would be, towards the end of the 1990s, Bill Clinton got into some issues, had some problems, and Al Gore, when he ran in 2000, kind of distanced himself a little bit from Bill Clinton, even though they had what seemed to be a pretty good relationship as president and vice president. Another good example is, George W. Bush, when John McCain ran in 2008, he wasn't even invited to the Republican convention to nominate John McCain. He came via satellite on a video, much like I'm doing with you, and then the screen went up, and then they moved on. But that probably had something to do with the fact that things like the Iraq War had become more unpopular than it was when we first went in. So another thing is the President is the national opinion leader. We kind of rely on the President to communicate with us and to oftentimes explain things to us. This really started back with Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Depression. There was a lot going on. Franklin Roosevelt proposed a lot of programs to try to fix issues. For example, he wanted a banking holiday, and the banking holiday would allow for banks to close, to basically restructure and then reopen. And this scared a lot of people. And so Franklin Roosevelt would actually kind of sit down and have a radio address. They called these fireside chats because people didn't have televisions, they had radios. And so you'd sit by the radio and you would listen to Franklin Roosevelt, kind of explaining how things work and how they function. And really, FDR kind of set the bar for what a president should do. The president does owe people explanations. The president should try to temper situations and kind of be somebody who encourages people to come together. And if a president does, propose something that does seem somewhat, like closing all the banks for a few days, we kind of expect a president to want to comfort people in those times and let us know it's going to be okay. So the national opinion leader is a big role. And finally, manager of the economy. I'm sure every president would go and flick a switch if he or she thought that the economy would be great. We do, however, when it comes to the economy, we do see that some people who are president when the economy is really good oftentimes benefit from that. If the economy goes down during a president's tenure, usually there's some blame put on a president. So, that may not always be fair. Certainly, if you look at Herbert Hoover at the end of the 1920s, it's hard to think of Herbert Hoover without thinking of the stock market crash. But it's important to realize he had been in office for a very short period of time when that happened. So, kind of hard to say it's all his fault. But he was in office, and the way he reacted to it definitely, garnered some criticism. Then again, in contrast to that, if you look at somebody like Bill Clinton, who was in office during the 1990s, when, we had a boom from Silicon Valley, and, this is when the internet took off and things like, Google were created. This is something that definitely helped him out. And so, some presidents have different policies on taxes. You definitely have presidents who think you should give tax breaks to the wealthy to try to stimulate growth. You have some presidents who come into office and think that there should be some kind of infrastructure programs to put people to work, but they will also kind of lead to revitalizing, economies in different parts of the country. So, there's a lot of different things presidents can do. The president actually gets to appoint the person who's the chair of the Federal Reserve, and that person can actually have a lot to do with different types of interest rates. But all in all, the president can benefit and can also get the blame for economic matters. But it's kind of important to always recognize that there are a lot of other things going on too. So I hope this is a good overview. Really quick too, the vice president has to have all the qualifications of the president for obvious reasons. And a vice president also serves as the president of the Senate, as I've previously mentioned. But other than that, the vice president really is somebody who oftentimes can be an advisor to the president. That was certainly the case in some previous administrations. But, the vice president is there in case, something were to happen to the president, and that's an important role. So, anyway, as always, if you have any questions or issues, please feel free to contact me.